Hi there, it's Marcus here, playing you some music. Pretty cool, isn't it? Yeah, I'm here to talk to you, of course, about History 300 and give you some of my own thoughts. And I want to obviously focus quite a lot on the blog because it's really interesting, but I want to focus on what's happening here in this music and in another piece of music. Certainly the other piece of music I can't play because I know I'd get struck straight away, slapped about the head by the YouTube fascists who, well, they're not really, they're just making sure that we play by the rules. Hey, what are the rules? Well, I'm not sure either, but I'm trying to work out how to get my here we are, get this back, and I want to share this with you. Yeah, because I would have started off with a piece by HIS300, who's this wonderful and quite eccentric, quite innovative band from Sweden mostly, who do this kind of shamanic sort of music from, an imagined Viking age, a Viking past, the shamanic past. And to me, it's really interesting because when we think about history, we think about history books and history articles and people spending a lot of time pulling things together in, the typical traditional formal sort of way that historians work. But a lot of people draw on history very intelligently to create elements of the past that you could say are living in the present. So I have a friend, Aaron Brown, who's an awesome early music violinist. And I've got an article put up by him for you under the course readings. And it's by him and me. We're in discussion just to illustrate the kind of thinking that goes on around how do we enter the past? Because when we have to deal with a question like, can history be objective? We need to understand that that question is almost, what would be the word? It's almost a red herring. It's leading you down, possibly down, the wrong sort of path. So much of my little talk this morning, it's morning here, is going to be about how do we handle that. So we're moving on into that now. So HIS300, fantastic band, and here they are. This is HIS300 here with the young girl with the antlers. And this is the woman from Iceland who you heard before, whose name is pretty unpronounceable to me, because Icelandic is one of those wonderfully sort of languages. So many years ago, I fell in love with early music scene. That's like many, many years ago. It's kind of like 50 years ago when I was a kid. For the first time, musicologists, that's kind of like the name for historians who are musicians or studying music and elements of music, were starting to actually pull together an understanding of how medieval English music or medieval French music or whatever would sound. There are wonderful musicians. I used to have it once somewhere as a CD. It's just come to me right now. This is totally impromptu. A CD of music created by two musicologists in New Zealand that were trying to recreate pre-contact with the West Maori music, for instance. We can see Indigenous Australians doing extraordinary things with their own musical traditions, blending them, of course, with contemporary music conditions and traditions. And of course, that's what both these guys are doing here. Women, should I say. HIS300 is a band of three people, 2 men and 1 woman. There's some really interesting material there, which I'm going to share with you. Each one of these images, Being and Being, have links to them, which will take you to a piece of music by both of those individuals. So I fell in love with this thing. And for me, part of it was the historical and the imaginative research that goes into reconstructing something totally intangible from the past. Remember, with heritage, you have tangible heritage and intangible heritage. Well, the intangible, of course, is the stuff you can't grab hold of. But there are ways, at least, to access some of that intangible stuff. The intangible, by very nature, is quite ephemeral, but it is also accessible by analogy. A lot of medieval music, European music, has been accessed through our understanding of non-Western musical forms. For instance, so the kind of instruments that we use, the kind of tonalities, because it was only, in the 18th century, 17th and 18th century, that really the tonalities of Western music, that's the keys, the major and minor keys and all that sort of stuff, settled in and became the norm. Before that, Western music sounded more Eastern, you might say, and so on. So yeah, lots of interesting stuff going on, but it's all intangible. So you need to use the imagination, but you need to use it rigorously. So rigor, that means following the rules, being disciplined about it, not stretching it too far unless you want to. Hilo, does this really, it's almost kind of Viking heavy metal, but it's terrific because it's they're drawing on quite early sounds, Tibetan throating down there, which is just a fantastic sound. And one of the three members of Heilong is really quite an expert at that, uses it beautifully. So what is it? How to be objective? Are they being objective? This is the sort of question you could be dealing with in your blog post, for instance. How authentic should we be? There are some people in the early music scene who are like vegans, it's got to be like this, it's got to be like this. And of course, that's not early music. They're using an 18th or 19th century violin or 20th century violin, or they are amping it, or it's the pitch of early music is 25 decibels lower than contemporary pitch. Our Western music pitch is based on the 440 decibels or vibrations per second or whatever it is. For some reason, somehow they've worked it out that early music was 415, for instance. But that's me being a nerd now, so I'll spare you any more, okay? But how authentic should we be? These are questions of objectivity, rigor, but also I think of accessibility. Some of what the readings that you're looking at in these first 3 weeks, how do we make music, and not music, sorry, how do we make history accessible? How do we reach people? So Clendenin is very much on about that. So's Tom Griffith, and so on. So this is a question that you really need to start thinking about now. What do you feel yourself? And this is a feeling as well as thinking thing. What do you feel about history as a legitimate process of conveying knowledge? You may have all gone on, if many of you probably have watched the series on Netflix, Vikings, for instance. How historical is that? How historical should it be? What's the tension between pure fiction, fantasy, make-believe, which of course often comes with a great story and great moral lessons and so on, and what it was really like back then to be a Viking, to be killed by a Viking, to be a monk in an English monastery or a Saxon, watching all these Vikings coming in and so on. What was it like? How much disturbance was there? What was the impact of Viking culture on English/British culture? How much can we see from the language, for instance? How many words have moved from, let's say, Viking, Scandinavian languages, Danish and Swedish and Norwegian, Frisian, Finnish, and so on, into the English language, and we can still see those elements today. That's something you can kind of quantify, and it's rigorous, it's scientific, and so on. So when you sit down and you watch something like Vikings, or anything else for that matter, that's of a historical nature, how close to the realities of that time is that, and how close should it be, given that it is an imaginative reconstruction designed as entertainment? So these are questions you can ask yourself. So following on from the Hai-Long stuff again, this is an interesting statement. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I'm putting it up there. So Christopher Yull is one of the members, founding members of Hai-Long. This is also an active link that will take you to go back to that will take you to a very interesting 15-minute clip on how Hai-Long formed, and what does it mean to each one. They use the word healing a lot, that these people, the three members, needed to be healed from the 21st century. They had really troubled youth and so on, a lot of, you could call it existential disorder. Who am I? What am I? How do I fit into this cruel world? And so on. So, you're invited to go and have a listen to that. But this is an interesting quote. I used to have something about the history, the past is another land. They do things differently there. But I took that out and I put this one in because this is more provocative. In order to connect with what was before, you have to disconnect from what is now. How true is that? It's true and it's false, in my opinion. We do need to have some distance. That's what I think connect and disconnect mean. So as a scholar, as an academic, you need critical distance from the subjects that you're observing. But at the same time, you need some kind of subjective connection with that past as well. And that means that these guys, for better or for worse, can't deny the fact that they live in the 21st century, that they're using recording technology and all sorts of stuff to create an atmosphere that seems to be otherworldly. And I just think that that's really interesting. So the creatively still has rules. And that's, I think, what objectivity is often, it really is, that objectivity is about the rules. But there's so much we don't know there. We don't understand elements of the past. We can never, as I said, the past is a different country or land. They do things differently there. There is so much that we will never know really about the past. We will never really know what medieval peasants might have thought about the world that they lived in as serfs or whatever it might be. We can guess. We can know that we can know from art and from all sorts of artifacts that they were still falling in love. There was still domestic violence. There was also a lot of other violence, which we don't have to endure because we have the violence of the state to protect us from ourselves, and so on. So, here it is. I'm talking about being ignorant and stupidity. It's really useful being stupid, by which we mean not sort of mentally impaired, I guess, cognitively impaired, but rather being ignorant, okay? Productive stupidity means ignorance by choice. I want you to consider that, ignorance by choice. Focusing on important questions puts us in the awkward position of being ignorant. One of the beautiful things about science is that it allows us to bumble along. So science is objective, right? To bumble along, getting it wrong time after time. And feel perfectly fine as long as we're learning something each time. So that's from a really fun article called The Importance of Stupidity in Scientific Research. And even though it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek sort of title, I really like it. It's pointing towards something very important, that there's a lot we do not know, and that they do not know. That gap in knowledge, of course, is an invitation to research, and it's also an invitation to recognizing our own limitations. There are limits to what we know. So in an additional reading that I've listed there, but it's not a set reading, from Elton, he talks about the fact that we need to be driven by the evidence, but that we can write something now as an historian, gets published, you're a great historian, but then 10, 20 years time, or next week even, somebody finds a new piece of evidence, some kind of data, you might call it, that fits into that sequence and changes the meaning of everything. Okay, and that's really exciting too. So ignorance can be cultivated, but it's a kind of unknowing, that you do by choice, ignorant by choice. So what are we doing in this course? Well, we're dealing with a bunch of questions, which is why the course is called Questioning History. So what are the rules of historical practice? Can historians be objective? What's the role of theory in practice, and so on? So these questions are obviously here on the slide, and the slide will be put up and shared with you, because that way you can get the links that I've embedded in this presentation. But it's these questions are also in the course outline. All right. So they're important questions, and they're questions that historians constantly keep on revisiting, as a practicing historian, or even as a practicing scholar. Many of these questions are just as important. Can history be objective is a question for all disciplines, not just for history. So there you go. There are the course topics. Okay. So assessment, writing a blog. I'm going to talk quite a lot about this now, to set the scene. So you've got to write a blog. How hard can that be? Well, it's if you read about it on websites and so on, it seems to be quite an art. But I'm not expecting you to sort of reach the great heights of blogger. But I've chosen this kind of assessment because a blog allows you to use informal language to discuss them. So I want you to engage with these first 3 weeks of reading. Okay, and I'm going to list them for you in a little bit, and discuss what's going on in you as you navigated this, but also what's happened in our first 3 weeks of tutorials, so that the discussions there should, or potentially at least, inform your own emerging thinking around, can history be objective? And I want you to write this blog post for your peers. That's the people in our group, right? And typos, some sort of weird thing happened there. Can history be objective? Okay. So it's a blog post demonstrating capacity to reference your ideas when necessary. Most bloggers embed hyperlinks in their blogs, but you can reference it however you like. A first or third person is perfectly fine. A lot of the blogs that I'm going to show you, they use the first person. So let's move on then. So a blog will typically include both a written and a visual elements. Okay, it's easy to read. It's in an article format so that visitors can swiftly browse through. Few key points often made up the front, a kind of summary at the end. So it's kind of an informal essay. There's a link to Wix, which is one of the great companies that host websites and so on blogging tips. All right, so you can go there. So for me, this is me thinking now, when you write your blog, link the question of objectivity to something that interests you. I would, right now, this morning, if I had to write a blog on this subject, I would write about music for sure, and about Heilung and the Icelandic woman and other aspects to that. Note how objectivity has rules. I would in an informal way, so look, objectivity is about acknowledging your bias. It's about staying as close as you can to whatever evidence we have, that sort of stuff. So for me personally, I'm interested in this tension between objectivity and subjectivity. If that interests you, you can explore it through an example. Okay, for me, I would be doing that through my own emotional relationship with early music, with world music in a sense, because it's very much, the Heilung particularly is very much a world music kind of example. And then I'd be asking questions of Evans, who does the writing on history on trial, and Hitler. Clendenin, who questions, can we represent the Holocaust? To Rösen, who gives us a model for historical consciousness. Bloggers, and a lot of them are very sort of naive. They offer us a traditional, simple, linear form of historical thinking and historical narrative, okay? But so Rösen would say that traditional or exemplary, but not many bloggers seem to be critical, okay? following Rosen's model? What are the insights from John Lukács and Fernando Zamesto? Are they useful? Or what does Barbara Tuchman have to say about the limits of what we can say about the distant past? Many students really like her work, one, because it's short, two, because she really nails a few problems about studying the past, okay? You don't have to do them all, of course. So you can't cover all of that. That's what I'm saying there on the heading. So think about how to construct a blog that says something, but not everything. You can't cover all of those folk. Pick up on some of their ideas. Locate it in a subject or topic area of interest. As I said, early music for me. Make it personal or chatty. See, for instance, how a few good history blogs do this. And I've got a few examples there. Note, however, that the history blogs tend to be totally narrative, telling us about a Viking grave find or the struggles of the Apache Indians, okay? Some do, however, touch on issues of fact and fiction, such as this very interesting one on the early Roman kings. Did you know Rome had kings? They were a republic and they were an empire and they had emperors. But before all of that, they had a series of Etruscan kings. And they got rid of them, I think, around 750, 752, something like that, BC or BCE. All right, so, and he does touch to some extent on the issues of objectivity and what we can and cannot know. All right. One of my favorite blogs, and sadly it's stopped for the time being, at least. The last post was from 2021, which is from here, and it's from Eleanor Parker, who is the clerk or a clerk of Oxford. And a clerk means a scholar, a writer, a thinker. A clerk is somebody who used to be a notary as well in medieval period. She's a medieval English scholar. Okay, but she has these beautiful blogs and she uses beautiful images. I think the next page has that. Am I right or not? Yes, there it is. So that's from her website, and so she has this to say. So you can hear her now being speculative, demonstrating incredible erudition, which means wide reading, knowledgeable. So talking about this writer, a 19th century English minister who wrote up a sort of a mock Anglo-Saxon carol based on a scrap of writing that had been found somewhere that was in Old English. So in 1911, she says, that same writer, that same winter in 1911, the young Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings and Hobbit, had just finished his first term at Oxford. A year or two later, in the course of his studies, he stumbled across the Old English Arundel poem, the one that had inspired this other writer she's talking about. And his first lines had a remarkable effect on him. To quote Tolkien himself, I felt a curious thrill, as if something had stirred in me, half awakened by sleep. There was something very remote and strange and beautiful behind these words, or those words, if I could grasp it, far beyond ancient English. So he's describing an emotional reaction to a piece of evidence, an Old English poem, the same poem that inspired this other guy to write his piece of mock poetry as a carol, that means a song. So she goes on, Tolkien adopted Arundel into his own growing imaginative cosmos. As a mariner, Arundel, this is now the character, who launched his ship like a bright spark, she's quoting Tolkien again, from the havens of the sun, a herald star and a sign of hope to men. He later called the Old English poem rapturous words from which ultimately sprang the whole of my mythology. So from one short statement about Arundel in Old English, Tolkien creates the whole world that we've all got to be grateful for. This the world of the Lord of the Rings, of Middle Earth, and so on. This whole cosmology or mythology. His sense, this is Eleanor now, his sense that there was something very remote and strange about the words Ella, Erendel, Engla Bethnast is one of those instincts no one can explain. Remember, so there's ignorance there. There's an instinct. We, in the present, Tolkien in his present, relating to something mysterious from the past. Why these lines more than any other? Who can say? That's the thing about bringing into your work the speculative, but anchoring it always in a thoughtful understanding of the world you're probing into. Okay, Eleanor is a fantastic writer. She uses visuals all the time. Okay, that takes you off to a YouTube clip as well. So, be creative, be playful. Don't be overwhelmed. Oh, I've never written a blog. I've spent all my life at university learning how to write an essay. Now he's asking me to do something different. Oh, I apologize. But it's because communication as historians, and many of you will be out in the big wide world, you're going to have to communicate with people. You're going to have to get your message across to them. And that's going to be really important. So what are the things then that we're dealing with here overall in the course? And of course, these might come up in this blog. Objectivity, of course. Historical literacy, that means knowing stuff. How well informed are you? That's the thing about reading Eleanor Parker's work. You just go, oh my God. And she's a young person. I'll put up an interview that I did with her last year for HIS300. So those of you who done history will already have seen this. She's the medievalist who's written this book, Winter in the World. And it's just beautifully written. Just, causality, why leads to B. And then, of course, there's the question mark that comes with causality. How come Tolkien could be so affected by 4 words in Anglo-Saxon English and create this whole world that he did create? Narrative, so that's important, how to tell a story, and explanation. That's often what I think in some history blogs that I've looked at is lacking. It's more narrative description. Meaning, what does it mean? So Eleanor translates those words as well as she can, and she seeks to land those words in an interaction between the past of the Anglo-Saxon period, the past of the 19th century, early 20th century imaginary, and our own time. There's hope versus cynicism. I think that's really important. History can cripple you if you think that look at all the bad that we've done over the millennia that we've been around. What good have we done, really? It's a bit like that old Monty Python line, what have the Romans ever done for us? Okay, and the conversations on the do's and the don'ts of history writing, which come out in many of the readings that you're looking at in those first 3 weeks, particularly. All right, so the readings and the videos, what makes for good history? Is there a recipe? This is a question that I want you to think about. Grow your own historical literacy. How much stuff do you know? Keep on feeding your historical knowledge base. I do it all the time. I have, like I showed you in the other videos, I'm holding on to my history magazines from National Geographic or whatever it might be. Just find things, and so you're always grabbing the tidbits of history, which are all fascinating. Doesn't matter what period of history it is, or at least doesn't to me. Though, like all of us, I do have my favorite periods. So my final thought then, objectivity is an important term. Once seen as the opposite of subjectivity, is now being understood more as a commitment to honest recording of events, intentions, and also the speculations that accompany these. There's a 2-minute clip there. I made it for a bunch of master's students in another course for another teacher who said, can you say something about rigor? Historic or scholarly rigor, that would be the way to put it. So I did this thing for 2 minutes, really short. You might enjoy it. Objectivity is quite emotional, in that those who claim to be objective do so with passion. I am objective. You can't do that. Science, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So reason is an emotion. It's not simply a clear-cut, cold, I was going to say rational, clear-cut, cold method for understanding the world. It is something that we get deeply committed to. Historical reason, biological reason, mathematical reasoning, they're all part of a family, and it follows rules. You can't not follow the rules in maths or chemistry. You've got to follow the rules. But then maybe if you reach that special point, a sort of Tom Griffith's point, a Clendenin point, you can start breaking the rules in little ways. You nuance them. Okay. So I've got another, it's about, I think, 10 minutes or something, 10 or so minutes, another clip that I made for another situation on reason and emotion and so on. So final then, good history is an attempt to probe the past honestly, according to a set of rules, those historical rules that we're talking about, in light of what evidence we have and the kind of sensitivity part as well as imagination to historical context that grows out of long research on a historical period. That's all from me right now. I hope it's useful, and I look forward to seeing you in week 1. All right, I'm going to stop this somehow.